Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had with Mark Boudreau. Mark's passion for motorsports led him to develop Motorsport Prospects, a digital publication with a mission to maximize a race driver's motorsport potential with access to the resources he or she needs to make wise decisions about his or her career. Dick and I believe this is a valuable conversation for Formula One fans to better understand the many factors an aspiring racer needs to consider when pursuing his or her dream. Before we get to our conversation, I need to ask, can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. Hope you enjoy our conversation. All right, Dick, we've got an interview.
Yes, we do. Looking forward to this one.
Me too. Okay, I think that we've just got an amazing fan of the sport, professional within the sport, and as a consumer of his content creation, I'm really excited to have this conversation because it has helped in developing my knowledge deeper into the sport. And as you know, I'm a voracious reader, and sometimes I'll read an article that this person has either created or tapped my interest into because of the way that he does his newsletter. It leads me down the path of learning more. And then I send it to you and to John and start asking you guys questions. So it's kind of fun to have the opportunity to talk directly to the source that has been a part of my knowledge base.
Absolutely.
So who we're speaking with today is Mark Boudreau. So Mark, thanks so much for joining us today for this conversation.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, you are the founder and curator of an amazing newsletter, in my opinion, Motorsport Prospects. And I think that it's something personally I would tell people that if they're at all interested in learning more about the industry, your newsletter, your publication is a fantastic publication to tap into. And then there's so many other things that they benefit from being a part of your media landscape. Tell us a little bit about your motorsport background.
Interestingly enough, I've never actually had the urge to race. My background's the law, and I was always fascinated with the business of motorsport. And I was one of those people that initially, and I'm dating myself, but I was, I basically got interested in Formula One in the early 80s with when Gilles Villeneuve, being Canadian, when Gilles Villeneuve burst onto the scene. And that's led me to kind of wonder how it was that a Canadian and an American actually could race into Formula One. What was the path? What did they do to get there? So I made the fateful decision to start buying Autosport magazine. And my interest was really more in the lower formula and the business of getting into racing, how they got sponsorship, why there weren't very many North Americans racing in Europe. And through that, I started to fall down that rabbit hole of the business of motorsport. And then that expanded beyond Formula One into sports car racing and, racing basically all around the world. And that was the other thing that I always found fascinating is that it's a true international sport. And I've always been oriented more towards an international outlook on things. So that ticked a lot of boxes. And that's basically how I got interested in racing. And then the end result turned out to be Motorsport Prospects through no grand plan. It was kind of an organic development.
Dick, you can see me grinning from ear to ear. So many things that Mark said resonated with me. I wonder how it resonated with you.
Well, I was laughing because I was sitting here thinking to myself, okay, so I've got 2 peas in a pod, and I think Mark and Sabrina are going to have way too much fun on this deal. To your point, Mark, I certainly understand the interest in the business side of this thing. I started off as a driver, but have certainly gotten involved, on the business end of the sport and have been for a long time. Not to the extent you are, but certainly have got some interesting connections. And I can understand what you're saying because it's fascinating how you can pull these things together. I'm right there with you.
Great. Good to know that other people have the same, it is a passion, right? I mean, there's motorsport, I've always said, is not driven by gasoline or ethanol. It is driven by passion because in a lot of ways, it is a ridiculous way to waste a lot of money. But you're hooked or you're not.
Yep.
Wow, Dick, that sounds like you right there. Oh, it's great.
Yep.
Yes, that's so fantastic. So let me ask you, because you come from the seat that you occupy of not being a racer, but you witnessed a lot of drivers trying to make their way up the competitive ladder. Was that the catalyst for the publication? Like you were having these conversations either as a lawyer or as a fan or supporter? Is that where you decided, like, I want to do motorsport prospects?
Yeah, well, actually, the way it kind of evolved was, I do tend to go to a lot of races, and strictly as a fan. So a lot of those races, they're not just Formula One races. There's Formula Ford, there's F4. To me, I'm just as happy being at a Formula Ford race in a small track in Ontario as I am being at an F1 Grand Prix in Vegas. To me, it's all part of the same big package. And so when I'd go to a lot of these races, especially the races with development series like F4 or F1600, I would talk to a lot of parents just out of curiosity. How did they decide to send their daughter to race for this team? What was the process they had to pick a series and a team? And I was quite taken aback by the approach that a lot of people took. In my opinion, it was extreme. Like I would often contrast it to how they would pick a university, for example. So their daughter wanted to become a dentist, let's just say. So I said, well, how did you determine what university to send your daughter to? And they would say, well, we would research, the best, dentistry programs, the ones that, we'd look at the ones closer to us. We would then go and, visit the campus and, ask a lot of questions. And I used to say, that's interesting because you're potentially spending more money on your daughter's racing career than on her university career. And yet you do almost zero due diligence. There's the lawyer in me. And that I found to be a bit concerning because it's a lot of money. So the initial impetus for Motorsport Prospects was to put together a directory of race teams aimed at parents who are trying to, who get the information to make an informed decision. That I wanted it to be independent and neutral and give them the background they needed to at least begin a conversation with team owners, team principals, because a lot of times they have zero information that they're working on. They might work on maybe the website of the race team, or it's through networking at the track. They meet somebody, however it works. And the thing about motorsport and team owners and principals won't deny it is that there's a major financial part of the sport, and so obviously you want paying drivers on your teams. That's part of the economic system that it works in. But with that in mind, people have to understand that they're not looking at their drivers necessarily always in the best interest of the driver. They're also looking at what's in the best interest of the team. So there's that financial issue. So I wanted parents to have a basic background for them to make an informed decision. As that evolved, and as I started building this directory, I started talking to a number of amateur drivers, or as they're sometimes referred to as gentleman drivers, and they were basically saying, it's not just parents of young drivers that need the information, it's us. I might be a extremely successful biotech entrepreneur, let's say, who wants to get into racing, but have zero knowledge of the industry. What series are out there about the team's same issue, and the same issue in that teams look at them sometimes as, basically a financial commodity and not necessarily in their best interest. So at that point, I decided, I think the whole concept of Motorsport Prospects should be essentially connecting race drivers to motorsport professionals. Essentially, anybody who pays to race, which is the vast majority of people racing, I want to give them as much information as possible so that they essentially get the best bang for their buck. And it also allows professionals to reach out to drivers, and help them in their journey, in their motorsport journey. So that's how it all kind of evolved. It was never a plan, but as things have moved along, and then I started writing the blog and curating a lot of information that a lot of drivers seem to find quite interesting and helpful. I sat back and had a conversation with a couple of people, and they said, you really should do a business plan, and you should, build this out. And so that's what I'm actually in the middle of doing. Is the website is actually being redeveloped by a developer. We are expanding and growing the directory. The blog will continue, the way it is, and we're in February. Kind of the new site will be launched, and it will be an actual, business, strictly focused on race drivers and what they need in order to essentially develop their careers. And only race drivers. It's not a place to go to find out who won the Grand Prix last weekend. It's not a place to go to find out who, what drivers are doing in their off season. This is essentially in a way a LinkedIn for race drivers, and it's strictly built on what they need. So that's it. That's kind of how it all evolved. It follows no real path. It's just been all over the place, and it's been an absolute blast to do because it's a heck of a lot of work, and it goes back to passion. If you're passionate about motorsport, you're willing to put in the time and the investment, because there's no way I could do this if I wasn't passionate about motorsport, because it's just a lot of time and energy but I love doing it, and it's a blast.
When did you start the publication?
Well, technically I started it in 2018. I started basically doing some interviews, but it was all over the place. I really didn't know what I was doing. I started the directory as well, but it was a lot of big learning curve. I had to start networking. I was almost doing it in a silo, in a little bubble. And then COVID, of course, forced everybody to rethink everything. And I thought, okay, what am I doing? Is this just something that I'm doing for fun? Can I possibly keep up? Because I was basically focused on doing interviews. Can I possibly keep up this pace of interviewing people? And then that's when I started thinking about the curating the information and building so I thought, okay, what I'll focus on is I will write my daily curation based on different topics. So, Mondays is driver development, Tuesdays is the business of motorsport and the business of racing. So sponsorship, how to get sponsors, that kind of thing. Wednesdays it's racecraft and so on and so on. And then I did put the directory on the back burner while I focused on networking and curating information and getting that out there. And now that I'm at that point, and I've been doing the column, I'd say for about 2 years in the format that it is now, that's when I said, okay, now it's time to start pushing the directory and really building the directory. So I think currently the directory has about 230 listings. I have over 6,000 listings in my database that will be transitioned onto the website, into the directory. And I'll be launching there'll be two forms of listings. There'll be a basic free listing and a premium listing. And that's what I'm in the process of building out. So it's going to be interesting. There's a lot of stuff that I haven't put out yet that I'm looking forward to getting out there. And so far the feedback I've been getting has been all positive. I mean, people really, drivers are looking for this information and often don't have the time to kind of compile all of this stuff. Professionals, team owners, they just want to be able to make sure that they're dealing with qualified people, essentially. They get, and I get a ton of them. They get a lot of emails from a lot of people saying, oh, I'm going to be the next Max Verstappen. And, they don't have the time to vet a lot of these people. And, it's the old story, probably 80% of them, it's a waste of time to pursue. I'm trying to help them narrow that down and vet that so that they can deal with essentially qualified leads. So yeah, that's kind of how like I said, it's been if you were to follow this into on a map, it was not a direct line from when I launched to where it is now. It's been all over the place. And a lot of it has been, been kind of formed from the base of when I've talked to a lot of people in the industry. And they're the ones that have said, really what we need is this, or, I think this is something you should look into. And based on their feedback and continued feedback, that's kind of how everything has evolved.
Dick, I'm wondering, as the racer in this conversation, we've shared your origin story in some of our earlier episodes. We have one dedicated to it. And of course, we've alluded to it in many of our other conversations. I wonder if what Mark is sharing about his vision and how this has progressed, how that's resonating with you, if this had been available to you as a young up and coming racer. Well, you're still a racer, but all those years ago when you started.
Yeah, certainly not young, certainly not up and coming.
They call you old though.
I can do it. Mark, I love the business model. I think back, not so much, in my early days when I was driving, but when I was running a team back in Houston. So this is 25 years ago, but it was F2000 cars. And I had two gentlemen drivers who were actually pretty skilled and certainly well-heeled. In one season, we won a Rookie of the Year and we won a championship. And yet, from a business perspective, the business was an absolute failure. I don't know how else to put it, but it was a sporting success. I said, gentlemen drivers, man, difficult to deal with. So then I get a kid the following year whose father was super enthusiastic about racing. The kid, not so much. And he was a disaster. And having a vetting system on any of those guys guys would have been amazing. I mean, just amazing. I think the value to the teams may be greater than the value to the driver, even though I can see that for the driver, it would be hugely valuable what you're offering there. Yeah, I applaud what you're doing because that's really cool.
It's interesting because I'm taking two different approaches. So for the teams, yeah, the vetting service I think is going to be critical. And for the drivers, I'm vetting at the other end. I'm vetting the sources that I'm putting in the directory. So, as we know, driver coaches, there's not a real licensing system. Anybody can call themselves a driver coach. So that's another part of the process, is to make sure that, the people that are in the directory are actual professional, driver coaches, for example. They know what they're doing. And I've had some really good conversations with some driver coaches, and that's exactly the issue that they brought up. As a matter of fact, one of them was basically saying, I don't need necessarily your service to get clients. I'm full, but I would like to be able to point, people that I can accommodate to Motorsport Prospects and say, just go on Motorsport Prospects. If there's a driver coach that is listed there, they know what they're talking about.
Yep.
And that's the other part of it, that I want to make sure that that the service is there, so that for drivers, it's like, or sponsorship consultants. There's another famous, position that, they're not all necessarily the same. They, the common complaint is they get their money, yet I don't seem to get any sponsorship. So, that's the other part of it, is to vet out the professionals to make sure they're truly professionals. So, and that's kind of where the legal part comes in, is it's due diligence. It's, asking questions and making sure, and I am building, I'm planning on building a board of advisors where I have some professionals. I don't think I'm necessarily the best person to judge, a driver coach, for example. So I want to be able to run it by a couple of professional driver coaches to make sure, this person, it seems that they're exactly what they say they are. Ultimately, it will be my decision at the end of the day, but I want some feedback from some trusted professionals myself. So yeah, I think it's something that's needed. It's what I've been told. It's something needed, and that's part of the impetus to move this beyond something fun to do on the side, and something that is professional and that's sustainable. That's the other thing. You can only go so far on your own. At some point, you need to make this sustainable financially, So that's kind of the next phase that I'm working on. But yeah, no, I appreciate the kind words, because it's something that I think the industry, the ecosystem, definitely needs.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And you're the only guy I've ever heard say, hey, you know what, we've got this need. And it's, speaking as a racer / business guy, or maybe a business guy / racer, I would say to you, you're really onto something. Don't quit. Because I think you're creating enormous value that maybe you don't even understand.
Well, I appreciate it. And it's great to hear from people that are racers, that are in the industry. And that's, to be honest, that is the main reason that I've kind of persisted in this, is just because that's the feedback I've been getting. And, I thought it would be, and, there's times where, we're all overworked and stressed out, and, life, you're busy with life. And then you're thinking, oh, do I really need to spend 3 hours Sunday morning, kind of plodding away on this? But it's when I hear feedback like that, where I say, I think this is worth pursuing. So, I appreciate that.
Great. Yeah. I think that it will do very well. I'll just put it that way.
Your timing seems to be very well positioned, because we have this influx of new attention into the sport, especially when you say North America. I like that. Canadians and Americans are, especially on the American side, a lot more kids, parents seeing the world of motorsport as an opportunity to see if they can be the next Max Verstappen or Lewis Hamilton, or I would even say Fernando Alonso. All of those different elements means that there's a flood of people who need that education, which is part of the reason why we decided to start the podcast, is that we believe that having a fan-based podcast that bridges that gap between what we see in the podcasting space of highly technical, or on the other end, super focused on all the drama and personality, let's come in and develop that depth of knowledge for people to understand the sport in its context and make it approachable and let people of different voices come in. So that's one of the things I think, when, as a consumer of what you were putting out, I was so impressed, is that you were hitting so many different notes. And that led me to wonder, it bringing you in today, is how do you aggregate and analyze all the stuff that is out? I know how much I consume. It's a lot. How do you look at that content, content and think about how it impacts the drivers? I mean, I weekly am looking forward to your publication. I just wondered, like, what's your sifting paradigm?
Well, it's built up over years. I am trying to use some tools that help me manage this better, but in a lot of ways, it's a lot of manual stuff, and it's a lot of there's a curation is not just an algorithm that pulls everything about driver development, for example. There has to be a bit of a personal analysis, a human analysis that's involved. So what I essentially do is I get a lot of newsletters. I'm pretty voracious on consuming content in LinkedIn. Pretty much all my connections on LinkedIn are motorsport related. Facebook, I'm not a huge social media fan, but Facebook, I would say the majority of the people I'm connected to on Facebook are involved in motorsport in some way. So I pull a lot of information from there. I essentially will, let's just say, for example, driver development. I'll pull a lot of this information. I have a system on my website that allows me to essentially connect different articles to different topics. And then for driver development, I'll go through all the list of links that I've posted, and I'll make a decision about whether I think this is helpful or not. Some stuff is maybe not necessarily helpful. Some stuff might not be from a source I consider to be a valid professional source. I want to curate information from people, I always say, from people that know what they're talking about. So, I want to make sure that if somebody's offering tips on racecraft, that they actually, have raced, and it's not just some kid in their pajamas, who, plays iRacing. So, that there's that part of it as well. So I essentially sift through that stuff, pick what I think is significant and helpful, and then I'll include that in my column for whatever the topic is. I'm trying to use some AI to help me pull some of this information in. But AI sometimes cannot necessarily determine, it's racing, but it could be horse racing. So, there's always going to be an element, in my opinion, AI, it's part of everything when it comes to AI, especially the legal business, in that AI is great at pulling a lot of things together, but I still think you need that human context that applies to that information and can decide, yeah, that's helpful, that not so much. And so it's a manual process in a lot of ways, but there's just so much stuff out there that is helpful to race drivers. And the feedback I always get is, I didn't know that this was available. I didn't know this free resource was available. I didn't know there was this program out there. So, part of the approach of the blog, which I call, news racers can use, is people don't have the time to go and find all this great, helpful information. So, part of the mission of Motorsport Prospects is to curate that stuff for you. And you can go through this fairly quickly and determine whether this is something you want to know more about or not. And if it is, you click on the link and it brings you to the original source. I don't copy all the information from the link. I give kind of basically a little summary or a taste of what it's about, and then I let the person decide whether they want to pursue that further. So yeah, it's a lot of work. I have tomorrow is racecraft and race series news on racecraft and race series, and then I have a column on sim racing. But sim racing, my approach to sim racing is always more of sim racers who are interested in becoming real world racers, and real world racers that use sim racing to basically hone their racecraft. It's less about like a pure gamer kind of thing. So yeah, it tends to be quite manual. There's a lot of stuff out there, but the feedback I've had is that it's pretty helpful to people.
Well, I can definitely empathize with that, and Dick is probably nodding his head. The quality is definitely there and very well worth any person listening to go and review, especially if you are not a new fan to the sport, to understand some of the things that racers that we eventually see on a Formula One grid, they've either had someone in their corner who's like you that they happen to develop that relationship with that help them navigate these issues, or they've had some rises and falls along the way that they had to learn these things to be able to be successful enough to get to the point that they're in. And so if we have someone like you who is trying to help help racers, not even just young, because we talked about that, but help racers make that transition better, smoother, it's actually giving them the opportunity to develop their craft and present themselves as best as possible as the racer. And then, as Dick has highlighted, for teams to have a greater level of confidence in the racer that's being brought taught to them, that's fantastic. And then, of course, the other professionals, which leads me to, you write on your publication that you see yourself as a guidance counselor for drivers. I love that. I think maybe that's the teacher in me, the educator, who thinks that, connecting kids with education and empowering them, individuals, only enables them to be better. So it's a fantastic seat that you occupy. So how do you think prospective racers need to approach their racing to maximize their potential, both on and off the track?
Well, a lot of it is applicable to life in general. The biggest piece of advice I can give to people, and this is from, and Dick, I'm sure will empathize with this, team owners, people involved in the sport have always said, you need to work hard. This is not an easy path to follow. You need to be willing to work hard. Just wanting to be the next Fernando Alonso is not going to help you become the next Fernando Alonso. There's a lot of work to be done, and the work is not just on the track. And I think that is one of the things that people don't necessarily realize. There is a tremendous amount of work to be done off the track in networking, in working on getting sponsorships, talking to driver coaches and all that. There's just a lot of very important, very hard work that has to be done. So you need to work hard. And that also leads to something that's really important, in that you have to be open to advice. And when I say advice, I mean constructive advice. Sport is interesting in that there's a lot of advice thrown out there, but it's not all necessarily constructive. Having been a hockey coach for 11 years, I've heard parents give constructive advice to their kids, and I've heard them give extremely negative advice to their kids. And that has an impact, especially with young drivers, young athletes. You have to realize that they're young. So they're not fully developed emotionally, physically. So, negative advice, maybe for myself, who is not young, I can basically filter that out. But for somebody who's 14 years old, not necessarily. So we have to be very conscious of that. So constructive advice is really important. They have to be open to that. And they have to be flexible in their options, in their career options, how they want to pursue motorsport. I would say probably the majority of young drivers see single-seaters as their eventual goal, whether that be IndyCar or Formula One. The irony is that probably the best opportunities that are available to young drivers is in sports cars. Now, they have to be, I often ask the question to young drivers, what is your ultimate goal? I want to be the next Ayrton Senna. And I say, okay, well, the percentages are very low in that happening. How about sports cars? No, I'm not interested in that. And then that tells me a lot about the driver. They need to be flexible. They need to understand that maybe racing sports cars is the way to go. Maybe Indy cars over F1, maybe USF 2000 over F4. They really have to be open and flexible in where they go and how they approach it. Because the thing about life as well as about racing is opportunities could come up, and you have to be open and you have to grab them when they happen, because racing is all about taking advantage of the opportunities that are presented to you. And there's a whole bunch of young drivers on the F1 grid this year and for next year that are there specifically for that reason. An opportunity presented them to themselves, and they grabbed it and they maximized it. So you have to be flexible. Those are really, really important aspects. But yeah, number one is work hard. I don't think people really comprehend how difficult it is to get to F1. But just to become a professional race driver. There's actually a video, and I quote and I post Enzo Mucci's stuff quite a bit, and he, in his latest video, actually looks at the percentages of drivers in F1, potential drivers that could make it to F1, and the percentages are extremely small. And this isn't a way to discourage people. Far from it. It's important that you be realistic and understand what the industry is like, and base your decisions on that. So if you say that all you want to do is race F1, you probably, won't go as far as you potentially could if you said, I want to be a professional race driver. And that's kind of my goal, whether it's in F1, whether it's in sports cars, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in North America, Japan, it doesn't matter. That's your ultimate goal. That's something that you will probably end up having more success with that approach. And who knows, that approach might end up in F1, but you have to be flexible and be open to the different opportunities that come up. So I think that's probably that's my main thing. It's work hard. It's a lot of work. And the great thing, in my opinion, about Motorsport Prospects is it gives you insight into that work that you need to do. So, for example, on Tuesdays, when I talk about motorsport sponsorship and marketing, there are seminars, there are resources that you can download to work with. There is advice, there are tips that help you navigate the whole industry of finding sponsorship. It's not easy. Again, it's a lot of hard work, but at least you have advice that's constructive and that's helpful, that's relevant and realistic, and you can use that to build your career. We need to. It's difficult to navigate anything without a roadmap, and a guidance counselor, having somebody who kind of help you steer you towards a goal, a right direction, is helpful. It actually helps alleviate some of the stress. So that's why I say Motorsport Prospects is essentially a guidance counselor. It's not telling you what to do. It's saying here are the tools that will help you make your decision, but ultimately it's up to you to make your decision. You get out of it what you put into it. Essentially that's everything. That's life, and motorsport is no different. It's essentially a microcosm of what life is all about, really.
I think that in our conversations over the podcast and then also offline, the guys and I have talked about how many life principles they gained as a result of trying to be competitive racers, and that has translated into their professional life now. And so I think that the way that you're approaching it and encouraging young racers to be resilient, to be flexible, to have that end goal, and as you said, have that roadmap makes a lot of sense, because those are things that you're going to need to do in life in general. I wonder is, when you have that person who is saying, hey, I want to be in single seaters, and then you say, well, are you open to other things? And you find someone that is willing to take that constructive feedback. What do you recommend that they do in their first few steps? When you're trying to ascertain how are they going to actually implement this idea of going and being competitive?
Probably the most important thing to do in motorsport is networking. And it's not just digital networking. LinkedIn, I'm a huge fan of LinkedIn. I use it. I've made some amazing connections on LinkedIn. That's the first step. It's really important. And a lot of young drivers today have struggled with actual in-person networking. And I mean shaking hands and looking into somebody's eyes. That is something that has we've lost a lot of that with a lot of this digital networking. So I'll tell young drivers, for example, let's say they're racing in Formula Ford for F1600. So they're racing on a series that there are other series racing that weekend, more professional series. I always tell them, and I'll see them sometimes sitting there between races on their phone, and I'll say, what you need to do is you're a race driver, zip up your suit and go and start walking around and introducing yourself in the paddock. Racers love to talk about racing. That is a fundamental part of being passionate about the sport. If you walk into a paddock and you're respectful and you understand people's time, and you just introduce yourself and you say, I'm racing in Formula Ford, and I just wanted to introduce myself, and those connections could pay dividends in the end. But you have to go out there and make those connections happen. And you can't rely, for example, for a young driver, you can't rely on your parents to do that. You need to be able to do that on your own. I think that is probably the most important advice I would give to somebody, is you need to network. And I have multiple examples of drivers that have taken that approach. And I know of one in particular who is racing in IMSA, who's a paid professional driver, who essentially got his drive from introducing himself to teams and making sure they knew who he was. And eventually he got a call from a team in Canada that said, we race in a series where the promoters are concerned that there's not enough cars on the track. They want more cars. We have a second car. If you can get here, you can drive the car. So, he had to pay to get there. He had to, pay basically all his expenses. He raced in that for that team for that weekend. And then that turned into another opportunity where they called him back, and then another team called him, and then it kind of snowballed from there. And he focused on small sponsors to help him pay for his travel expenses, things like that. He worked on those small sponsors. Then he would get those seats he would take advantage of. And the other, of course, ultimately important thing is he was fast. You have to be fast. And I don't mean you have to necessarily win a race. You need to show that you can consistently perform, and that you're consistent, and you're getting faster, and that you're progressing. So he was fast, and he parlayed that into eventually a seat racing in IMSA as a professional driver. And he's had opportunities to race in Europe. And that was from working hard, networking, networking, and ultimately and being fast. Those are the things. And it doesn't matter what level you're at. It doesn't matter, heck, if you're even doing rental go-karts. You just need to make sure that you network and take advantage of people that are there. And it's not to take advantage of them, but to take advantage of the opportunity to connect with them. There's some extremely successful people racing in motorsport. Even if you network with them about something other than racing, you're involved in a legal career, you're involved in biotech, you're involved in whatever, and this person happens to run a company and they also race. Well, that can be a connection as well. You can be talking about biotech and, oh, by the way, I see that you also race. How does that fit in? How do you fit that into your career? And those are networking. We're all human beings, right? People like to talk and communicate with what they do and what they're passionate about. So, do the same. You have to network. That, I think, is probably the most important thing to do. Even if you're not racing, go to races and network, introduce yourself. I would love to become a driver. I'm doing this, I'm doing that to get there. Do you have any advice from me? People in racing love to give advice, so take advantage of it. Again, be open to that advice, but network. And networking is not easy. If you are not a naturally outgoing person, you're an introvert, which I am in a lot of ways. It's sometimes difficult to break out of your comfort zone, but the benefits will far outweigh any thought you might have of being embarrassed or not knowing how to approach it. You'll see within 30 seconds talking to a fellow racer. I walk up to, let's say, Dick, and we start talking. I just want to say hi. I think it's really cool that you race, in F2000. He'll probably start talking and not stop talking until I essentially interrupt him, because he would love to talk about racing. So just remember that everybody is there for the same reason, and they're glad to talk about it, but you have to introduce yourself and you have to network. You have to make the effort.
I was going to say, Mark, have we met before?
Exactly. When I used to go to the Grand Prix, I used to, because I go to the Canadian Grand Prix every year, and I used to go by myself for years. And my parents would say, I don't understand. You don't know anybody. And I always tell them, I can guarantee you within about, 10 to 15 minutes, I will end up chatting with somebody, because we're all there for the same reason. There'll be no problems meeting people. And I do. And it's the same as a fan. It's the same as a driver.
Yep.
People love talking about racing.
Yep, for sure. Yeah. And it's really fertile ground for business conversations like you were talking about. Honestly, it really is.
Yeah.
Well, Dick, I actually thought of something you said. I think it was when we were talking to Ayrton Hauk. Both of you had discussed how deals are made at the racetrack just as much as the development of your racecraft. And it was something that stuck with me, is that, because like-minded people, friendships develop. And especially if you are in the world of business, you're going to want to work with people that you've seen their passion, their discipline, their dedication, and their resilience. That's going to translate to wanting to bring that into your business world if you have a convergence of business interest. So I think that, Mark, what you're saying to drivers who are wanting to take those first steps makes complete sense. One of the other questions I would ask is, if you are the driver who is, a great example is the person you just said, who because of his willingness to push himself out there in a good way of networking, he's now strategically placed for the opportunity this team is giving him. How do you advise a racer who is thinking about the other side, the teams and their investment on them, how to make sure they feel good about that investment? What should they be doing?
It goes to the work hard part of it, but and I think Dick will appreciate that as somebody who's run drivers. Team principals want to see, and again, they want to see somebody works hard. Ultimately, they have to be fast on the track, consistent and fast on the track, but they want to see how they work outside of the cockpit as well. And I'll give you a perfect example. Two drivers competing for a team. One, as soon as essentially qualifying is over or the race is over, leaves, goes back to their hotel or whatever. The other sticks around, asks the mechanics if there's anything they can do to help. Ask the team principal, do you want me to post some pictures on social media and update, our fans on, how the team has been doing? Sticks around until everybody is done for the day. Is willing to go, and you guys, anybody need a drink? Anybody, can I get you some sandwiches? Is there for the long haul, wants to be helpful. Teams look at that and they say, this is somebody that we can work with. And it's an important factor when they're looking at, because, again, there's a budget, right? And you pay to race. But a team will look at a driver and say, this kid is fast. This kid works hard. This kid integrates well with the team. They ask questions. They're helpful. They don't necessarily have the full budget they need to race. What can we do to kind of maximize their opportunity? And basically take what they've got as far as budget and and use it to its complete maximum, because we want this kid to race with us. Those are questions that the other kid, they won't be asking that. They will purely, to be honest with you, will probably say, you know what, he's okay. He's pretty fast, but he's got the money. So this is what we'll do. We will take that first kid, we'll take his full budget, but we'll actually, and then in a sense, we'll use him to subsidize the other driver who we know is going to be a productive member of the team. That happens all the time. And so, you have to realize that what you do out of the cockpit is almost as important as what you do in. And teams understand that. It's all about chemistry, which is why I always tell young drivers, or any driver actually, if you're thinking of racing for a team, it's always a good idea, even though there's a financial outlay involved, it's always a good idea to do a test session with the team. See how you fit in. What kind of rapport do you have with the mechanics, the engineers? Those are really important, and it's important vice versa, right? Because if there is no chemistry, nobody's going to go faster than what they've done. Engineers need to be able to speak to somebody. They need to know that they're being open to advice, and they will implement that advice. Some people do and some people don't. And a test session will usually it will set up red flags on both sides, if there are some. And that's an important thing to, before you go and spend whatever it is, $250,000 for a season, you might want to make sure that you're going to get the best out of everybody. And, and so that is really important. So I would say, obviously being fast is extremely important, but being a team player, it is a team sport. The drivers get all the glory, but it is a team sport. And how you carry yourself out of the car, reflects on you as a driver. And it's not just the team principal. It is the people that are actually working on the car, the people that are doing the marketing for the team, the people that are paying the bills. The sponsors. Do you reflect well on the sponsor? All those things are extremely important. So understand it's not just about you, getting on the podium. It's about a whole team. And you really have to be conscious of that.
Yeah, I have an old saying, there's a lot of really good looking fast guys sitting in the grandstands because they don't understand any of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And look, the reality of racing is there are some people that are there that, theoretically do not belong there. It's part of the sport. It will always be part of the sport, but you, unless you, look, even if you have a gazillion dollars or your parents have a gazillion dollars, that advice still applies, as a matter of fact, it might even be more important because some people that are working with you on the car, your engineer, your mechanics, they might look at you as just somebody who's there because you have a lot of money, and you might have even a bigger, it might be a bigger task for you to actually convince them that, no, I'm just as passionate about racing as you are. And so, you're going to have to prove that. And by being a team player, like I said, by doing those things, there are stories of all kinds of drivers. Niki Lauda is one of them, where he used to stay for hours after the race was done and was working with the mechanics. Yep. And was, giving feedback, and he was part of the team. So what do you think the team is going to do when push comes to shove? They're going to be behind that driver because he's one of them, and look, that applies to life as well, right? But that's extremely important for a driver. Check your ego at the door, and be open to advice and be a team player.
We know that racers need to have a certain level of ego because they're about to do. That is a requirement, right? But also knowing how to package it, when to unleash it, is part of the maturing process. And it goes back to what you said about how you would give that kind of feedback to a 14-year-old and to a 24-year-old or a 34-year-old is going to be very different, but it's necessary for each stage, no matter what you're trying to do, as you're trying to walk through that journey of developing yourself as a racer, to be mindful of how you're balancing when that ego is really unleashed. I feel like you've kind of given a couple elements of it. In your opinion, as the guidance counselor, what do you see as the ideal driver package today? I think personally, I have an opinion, and I think it's changed over the course of the sport, but I wonder from your seat, what do you think really is the ideal driver?
Well, ultimately, they have to be fast. That's pretty much the end all and be all of this is they have to be fast, consistent. That's the other thing. Teams do look at how you progress if they're evaluating you as a scout, as a prospect. They want to see that. They don't want to see necessarily that you were on the podium one race and then were last the next race and struggled to get out of the bottom third the following. Like, they want to see that you consistently perform at whatever level it is. So speed is critical. Again, work ethic is really important. The team racing is sponsorship driven. And it's extremely important that drivers drivers reflect well on their sponsors. And that is a huge learning curve for a lot of people, which is why, media training, for example, is extremely important. Young drivers especially tend to approach everything with an I approach. I did this and I did that, and often won't even mention their sponsors. So, it's sponsors are kind of like, what the heck am I spending all this money for when, the driver's not even saying a word about us. So, you have to make sure that you reflect well on your sponsors. And by reflecting well on your sponsors, it's obviously mentioning your sponsors, understanding what the heck your sponsors do. When somebody says the ABC widget car was really fast today, and somebody asks, well, what does ABC widget do? And if the driver has no clue, the sponsor won't be too thrilled about that. So understanding what your sponsors, what they do, reflect well on your sponsors, be professional, be respectful. It boils down to the same thing in life, that everything you say reflects on who you're racing for, which includes your sponsors, which includes your team, which includes your series. So, remember that when you're talking. Sometimes it's a better idea to pause in the heat of the moment before you say anything. And we all know that from this fun time we're having with swearing in F1. It's an emotional sport. I tend to agree with, Verstappen when he says, maybe if you'd stop shoving the microphone in our face as soon as we get out of the car, and give us a chance to, to kind of decompress slightly, we won't be so salty in our language. I think he has a good point, but at the same time, look, you got to be professional. But yeah, I think that those are the main things. You got to be fast, got to be a team player. You have to work hard. You have to reflect, make sure that you're reflecting positively on your sponsors, and on your team and on your sport. Those I think are the key things. A lot of the technical stuff is technical stuff, but those are general guidelines that you should be following. But again, I can't emphasize enough, you could be a sponsor's dream, but if you're always last, your career is not going to be sustainable. So that really is a primary thing to keep in mind.
So, Dick, I know that, we've not hidden this from our audience, is that this is not our day job. This is, as Mark has highlighted, it's a passion and it's a part of overall work that we do inside of the motorsport world. You have actually had to step out because your day job is calling unexpectedly. So yes. You're trying to do a little bit of crisis management while we're having this lovely conversation. I want to allow you to gracefully exit so you can go handle that crisis. If it's okay with you, I'd like to continue having the conversation with Mark, because as you alluded to at the beginning, I'm kind of geeking out right now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And apologies, but Mark, thank you so much. And I love what you're doing. Y'all take care.
All right. Thank you. You too.
Bye. Bye. Thanks, Dick. Okay. So Mark, I have a couple more questions in this vein of guidance counselor. And then I actually want to get into a couple on hot topics in the world of F1, if that's cool with you.
Sure.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, we've looked at the driver in the early part of their career, thinking how they're presenting themselves, how they're looking at the team's investment and making sure that they're really managing that. But there's going to be, and Fernando Alonso is the exemption to this, but there will be a shelf life to your racing career. And as we said, a lot of the things that you learn inside of racing are life principles. How do you encourage drivers to plan for their life after motorsport, or as competitive drivers, or attempting to be competitive and or professional drivers?
Well, one of the things that's really important that I've always, when it comes to young drivers, is I've always stressed is that education is key. You really need to make sure that you have, a plan B. Some of the most impressive drivers that I've dealt with, young drivers, are pursuing a degree in engineering or in marketing, or they're getting their MBA because they understand that the percentages are quite low. So, and they want to be involved in motorsport, but if their philosophy is, if I can't be a driver, I want to be an engineer. I want to be involved in the business of racing. I want to be a lawyer, so and negotiate driver contracts. Whatever it is, that's extremely important that you do not forget the education component of it. It can be difficult especially for young drivers who, for example, might be racing in Europe from North America, but the education is key. It also allows you to understand the other side of the business. So if you're taking mechanical engineering, for example, there are things that you will start to understand that an engineer does, or a mechanic, that you would not have understood otherwise. Same with the business part of it. You're doing your MBA or you're doing a marketing degree. You will understand parts of the business that you might not necessarily have understood. And if you do in fact pursue that career in that direction either after your career is over, or if your career as a driver doesn't go the way you were hoping it to ago. The fact that you were a driver makes a huge difference in people's perceptions of you. If, for example, you want to do marketing for a team or a series or a sponsor, right away they see that you understand the driver perspective, and that is extremely important in when they're talking to drivers. So yeah, education is really, really key. Just because you can't be a driver, just because that doesn't necessarily work out, doesn't mean you can't be involved in motorsport. I'm a perfect example. I mean, I'm involved in motorsport, not in the cockpit, completely outside of it. And, I made that opportunity happen. And people, have to have that philosophy, that mindset that, if I can't make it here, I'll make it happen there, and do it, and pursue it. Because, it's a tough sport. Yeah. Fernando Alonso is a freak of nature almost, that guy. I mean, he is, and look, the lifespan, and I don't mean to say it in the lifespan of a driver, but, your career lifespan is increasing just because racing is becoming so much more safer. But don't assume that your career is going to last forever. I've dealt with sports agents in other sports, and essentially, for example, the NFL, the average career is 3 to 4 years. People don't realize that. So that athlete, has to make sure that when they're competing, that their money is being properly handled, which a little bit of a plug, but on Motorsport Prospects, we do have a regular column by a financial advisor that talks about that. It talks about the importance of making sure that your money is properly handled while you're making it, so that when your career is over, you have something to fall back on. And it's the same with the education. So even if you do have a great racing career, it lasts, let's say, 10 years, you still have opportunities afterwards in motorsport that you can pursue because you've done these steps beforehand or during your racing career.
Fernando, I think also not only because of his career shelf life, I think when you were talking about of a prospective driver where their goal is, Fernando also has shown that his willingness to go across disciplines inside of motorsport, which has also, I think, possibly extended that career because he's maintained that agility and he just wants to be fast. I would imagine that started early in his career, that he, even though he may have wanted to be on the Formula One grid, probably was very astute to know, I just want to be in a car that I can do the best that I can. And his diligence in that has actually reaped many benefits on the long term for him. So on another piece is, we know as lawyers that contracts can be challenged and or negotiated away. We've seen that recently in the world of Formula One. I think people get super confused by this when they hear, oh, the driver has this contract and is going to be here for the next 2-3 years. But there's a lot of stuff that can happen that could change that from ever becoming truly the full duration of where that driver is in that team. How do you counsel drivers for that possibility?
Well, I've always said that contracts are not there for when things go well. Contracts are there for when things do not go so well. So it's important to understand what you've signed, what your obligations are, and what your team's obligations are. And it's critically important to understand what kind of conflict resolution process is involved in there. So, things don't go well. Let's say the team has decided they do want to replace you for whatever reason. Make sure that in your contract, there is a procedure to deal with that scenario and that you're aware of what it is. You got to make sure you're not giving up your rights for any kind of short-term gain. That's critical. But like I said, it's contracts are usually never mentioned when things are going great, and nobody even looks at it. Even if it's a bad contract, it's not necessarily an issue. It's when things aren't going so great. So it's extremely important that you understand both sides of the coin, what their obligations are, and understand how do you deal with a conflict? How do you deal with a scenario where, for example, in the contract there are a number of performance clauses, and if they're not being met, there's a scenario where this is what's going to happen. But are those performance clauses clear? Did you clearly understand them? Do you both understand? Are you both basically working on the same playbook? Those are things that are extremely important, which is why it is critical. And I'm not speaking this because I'm a lawyer, but I am. You need to have somebody who understands what they're talking about to review this contract. People have signed some really bad contracts because they didn't understand what their obligations were, and I actually wrote a paper in law school on the famous Michael Schumacher contract with Jordan when Benetton scooped them, and it all boiled down to the language used in the contract, in the negotiations. You really need to have somebody who understands contracts to review it. Somebody who also understands motorsport, it would be critical as well. Again, not to blow my own horn, but part of Motorsport Prospects in the directory is we have a number of lawyers, and that is going to be expanding, who who specialize in motorsport law, who understand what is involved, and those are the kind of people that you want on your team, your personal team, to review, to be able to review these contracts. The other thing to keep in mind in sports is that contracts are only as good as the athlete's willingness to compete. If a driver does not want to race for a team, regardless of the contract, the team has to make a serious decision about whether it makes sense to, essentially employ somebody who doesn't want to race for them. This again is where the, understanding the obligations and understanding the conflict resolution, what are the penalties for breaking the contract? What are the scenarios for where you can walk away from a contract? All that kind of stuff is important to understand, but ultimately, look, they're human beings. And if a driver or a team has expressed a lack of interest in having the person continue to race for them for whatever reason, it's not a great idea to stay in a situation where you're not wanted. So you have to understand what do you do? What can you do? What does the contract allow you to do? And that's where a poorly drafted contract that you signed could come back to bite you. You might end up with nothing if you're not careful. So contracts, despite what people say, and they'll say that contracts are not worth the piece of paper they're written on. Well, that's absolutely untrue. They are extremely vital and important, but they're only as good as what the language is in them. And it's important that you understand that. And it's important that if you don't understand that, you get somebody who you trust, who will explain that to you. They're a critical part of their career, and they can reflect on your future prospects, right? How you react to a contractual situation will say a lot about you to other teams. And we saw a lot of fun with that with Piastri and last year. And so you've got to be careful about how you react to those things. And ultimately remember that regardless of what a lawyer says, it is your career. You are the person that ultimately is signing the contract. As long as you understand what you're signing, ultimately it is your decision. But, advice is extremely important.
Do you find that people are resistant to that? Like, I guess I come back to what you said about the example of how you vet a college versus how you vet your motorsport career. Do you find that people see the value of really looking at that contract, having a counsel from a legal counsel look at, or even just minimally review it and just make sure? Or is there just a viewpoint of like, I'm just so glad I got someone being willing to sponsor me. I'm happy to sign on the dotted line. This is going to advance my career. And I'm not really going to worry about it.
That's exactly what a lot of, especially with young drivers, that's exactly the scenario that it is.
Really?
They don't necessarily want to rock the boat. They want to take advantage of the opportunity when it presents themselves. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's an emotional decision more. And you have to understand that racing is as much a business as it is a sport. And it might be a bit of a tough pill to swallow, but if the advice that you're getting is that this is really not good for your long-term career, I would highly recommend you do not sign it. Some people just don't want to hear that. So their solution is just not to even ask the question. That's not the way to go about motorsport. It is a high stakes, a very expensive sport. And you really need to understand the business part of it. And you have to understand, and part of Motorsport Prospects is enabling you to build a team of advisors, right? Of motorsport professionals who are advising you on the best way to do things. Young drivers are of course constrained by their parents. The parents are often writing the check. And sometimes that's a tough thing to deal with because the parents might not be the ones wanting to get the advice. What do you do? Well, essentially at that point you live with your decision that you've made. But I will always counsel people to be aware. Look, at the end of the day, a good lawyer will often offer a free 30-minute consultation. Write as many questions as you can about your situation and take advantage of that 30 minutes. And a good lawyer will recognize that while this 30 minutes is free, this could be potentially the beginning of a long-term relationship that maybe as the driver progresses, they will in fact employ that lawyer to help them, negotiate contracts as they go. So, the lawyer has to also understand, give good advice, be a good advisor, because that could potentially pay off for them professionally going forward. But that would be my advice to a drivers. Use that 30 minutes, go into the Motorsport Prospects directory, pick out a couple of lawyers that are, let's say, close to you, or, at least in your country, and contact them and ask for that. The COVID, if they're the only good thing that came out of COVID is we all became fluent in Zoom. So use that Zoom call for 30 minutes, and most lawyers will not hesitate to give you some advice and take that advice. There is that hesitation. I think the older a driver gets, the more that they understand the importance of it. But for sure, when they're young, it's the same with musicians. They think, this is it. I've got to take this chance. I might not ever get it again. You might not, but you might also live to regret it, as a lot of musicians have found out, at the end of the day. So yeah, I would definitely, like I said, there are free consultations you can take advantage of, and most lawyers are more than happy, and they don't have to necessarily be motorsport lawyers, but they're more than happy to give some advice for, pro bono, essentially.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it is probably because we're both lawyers that we feel very strongly about it. But that's part of the reason why you join the profession, is understanding the value of understanding intricacies of the laws, your rights and responsibilities, and you want to help people. So I think it's great that you highlight that most attorneys have those free consultations, and going in armed with your questions maximizes those minutes and also gives you a greater level of confidence, I think, after you walk away, that you've asked the questions. And even if you disagree, at least then you have something to go back to and say, well, I explored this, I made the best decision, I chose whether or not to follow that advice. And then especially, I think most people that come in like that realize if they're vetting that attorney, if that attorney knows what they're talking about and is going to be wise to maintain that relationship moving forward. So and I think it's why many attorneys are willing to do that, because we understand it's a part of our mutual beginning of a potential relationship, is that necessity of a consultation. Okay.
It's like a test session. Yeah. Essentially the same thing as a test session with the team. You're testing out, again, it's all about relationships, right? We are human beings, and lawyers are not robots. They're humans. And, and I agree with that. The confidence level is really important. I think the biggest complaint clients have about lawyers is that the lawyers don't listen to the clients, or that the client has no idea what the lawyer just told them, because they often will use legal talk. So yeah, if you have a list of questions, and again, maximize your time. Ask, sorry, I have no idea what you just said. I don't know what liability means. I don't know what, resolution, don't be shy, just ask.
Okay. So I could keep going, and as Dick would say, geeking out on this, but I want to go into a different section of questions. And I also know time is racing from us. So we may just have to do a follow-up session sometime, Mark, if you're open to it.
Absolutely. I'm glad to do it.
Here's my first hot topic with you. Did you foresee the current surge of American interest in Formula One? If so, what were the indicators to you? And if not, do you attribute that to Liberty Media's acquisition of Formula One, the Drive to Survive, COVID, like many people do? Or is it something else?
Well, yeah, again, I'm dating myself, but I remember watching the United States Grand Prix presented by Iceberg, which I still don't know what Iceberg is, in Phoenix, Arizona. And it was a pretty sad sight. I think, if there were 10,000 people in the stands, I would be shocked. And I used to find it frustrating. I mean, when I first started watching F1, there were races on the East Coast, there were races on the West Coast. There were 3 races in the United States that a lot of current fans don't realize. There was the Long Beach Grand Prix, there was Watkins Glen, and there was a race in Vegas. I mean, it only lasted 2 years, and it was in a car park, but so I always found it, I never could have really understand, but I think part of the reason was that IndyCar was so strong for the longest time. So Americans have so much, regional sports to follow, that they almost don't need to look internationally. And IndyCar in the 80s and in the early 90s was, rivaled F1 in a lot of cases. I mean, heck, you had Nigel Mansell come and race in IndyCar. You had Ayrton Senna testing a Penske IndyCar with thoughts of potentially coming to IndyCar at some point. So it was extremely strong series. They raced internationally. So what really did Americans need from F1? They didn't. And there were no Americans racing, really. But then I found that despite the debacle of the tires, when F1 went to Indianapolis, I thought you could see that there was a hunger for the sport. And this was way before Drive to Survive. I've always found that there was a passionate core of F1 fans in the United States. I don't think having a driver was necessarily super important to them, or even a team. Obviously, they would love to have it. I mean, Eddie Cheever raced in F1 for years, and he's an American. I think they did and they do love the sport. I think what Liberty Media has done to really build and open things up is, and I should admit that I've kind of stolen this from somebody who wrote an analysis on it, but it makes sense to me, is that they've allowed the teams and they allowed the drivers to share, for example, on social media. And people have seen them as drivers. Motorsport, F1 has always been insular. It's always been exclusive. And Liberty Media pulled back that curtain slightly and allowed people to see inside the zoo. And people liked what they saw. The fact that the series has become more competitive, kind of in the same time of Drive to Survive, it definitely helped. Drive to Survive absolutely has contributed a huge amount. But what I'm always curious about is, it's like a pendulum, right? It swung one way for the longest time and it's swung the other way, the opposite way now. At some point, it's going to kind of find its, middle point. I think a lot of new fans are going to stick around because they've been introduced to sport through either Drive to Survive or like social media. They love it. Some of the other ones who maybe had been more attracted to the event and less the racing will probably fade off, and that's fine. But I think the core, I think they've definitely expanded the core through multiple avenues. Drive to Survive. They're, like I said, they're sharing on social media. I think that's a huge part of it. COVID, obviously it was, you don't want to say COVID was good timing because, COVID is never good timing, but, it did kind of happen to be good timing for Drive to Survive. But I think Americans have always loved Formula One and Ferrari. Ferrari is Ferrari. As long as Formula One has Ferrari, there will always be that will always bring in a certain element of people. But I think the interest I think the interest was always there. I think the fact, unfortunately, IndyCar has slid a little bit into irrelevance, and I don't want people to scream at me because I love IndyCar, and I want to see it actually build and become what it used to be. But I think that, as that has faded a little bit in people's minds, Formula One has taken up the baton and kind of run with it. But I think the current level of interest will probably decline slightly. Like I said, for what I call the Instagram fan, that will slowly go away. The interesting thing will be to see how that'll affect the American Grand Prix. I think COTA is here to stay. I think, those true F1 fans will, that will be something that they'll always gravitate to. I think the Vegas race, as long as it's making money for the casinos and the hotels, will remain, just because it's a kind of a cool event. My question is over the Miami race. I don't know if Miami will be around in 5 years. I could be wrong, but I think I think that might be one race that potentially is more for the Instagram crowd than for the the kind of the diehard F1 fan. And of course, that all changes if there's ever a race in New York. A race in New York would completely upend everything. I think COTA would still remain. The other two races potentially would not, because I think New York City, anything around New York City, if they could ever pull it off, and they've tried multiple times, I think that would be the big money race. That would really change the perceptions in the U.S. and globally. But yeah, I think fans will still continue to follow the racing in F1. Like I said, I just think some of the fans will probably drop off. But I think it's built more hardcore interest in the series, and I think for the most part that will remain, regardless of if there's a driver or if there's a team. I think they'll still stick around.
Do you think if there was a New York race, it would also affect your Canadian Grand Prix?
No. The Canadian Grand Prix is, quite honestly, it is a cornerstone of the F1 circuit. Canadian fans are absolutely passionate about F1. I go every year. There are never, ever any empty seats. It's gotten to the point where, quite honestly, financially, it's getting a bit ridiculous, the pricing, but that doesn't seem to turn off anybody. And the interesting thing about the Canadian Grand Prix is that every year I meet fans from Europe that actually find it more cost effective to fly to Montreal for 4 days and watch the Canadian Grand Prix than to watch a race at either like Silverstone or Spa. Or it's getting that expensive. So they actually come here, take a little bit of a vacation, and with our interest, with the exchange rate, it's actually cost effective for them. So no, I don't think a New York City Grand Prix would affect the Canadian Grand Prix. Canadian fans are just hardcore. They're in it, Canadian driver, Canadian team, doesn't matter. They're there for the love of the sport, and they'll stay there for as long as F1 will have them, quite honestly.
It's so interesting. I have so many follow-up questions I want to ask, but I really want to get to the other hot topic. We'll just have to put that to our follow-up conversation. So let me ask you this. We've highlighted that you're Canadian and you have a strong understanding of our American motorsport. Really, I like the way that you look at it, North American motorsport community. Why do you think we're not seeing more Americans on the Formula One grid?
Well, part of the problem is that the FIA driver pyramid, as they call it, is really European centric. Now there is F4 and Formula Regional in the US. Those series are struggling a little bit. Quite honestly, a young driver in North America really would tend to look at the US F2000, kind of that what used to be called the Road to Indy. They tend to look at that series more than perhaps the F4 series. And the FIA is definitely, I don't think they give American motorsport, the respect they're due. I really don't. I mean, and this has nothing to do with nationalism or anything like that. I don't think they, for whatever reason, think that, for example, Indy Next is comparable to F3 or F2. And I think that's misguided. I think that's slowly changing as more Europeans are going to North America and potentially moving back to Europe. For example, now you see McLaren has an F1 and an IndyCar team, and they're starting to use that to give IndyCar drivers opportunities in F1, at least testing. So I think you're going to see more of that cross-pollination. And I think the FIA will have to, accept the fact that, racing is strong. Okay, sure, it's not part of the quote-unquote pyramid, but, so what? They deserve the respect. It's amazing racing. They deserve the respect. The other issue is there are a lot of differences in the approach in racing in Europe as in North America. A lot of drivers from Europe will find North American racing to be more, there's more of a comradeship, there's more of a connection with the drivers. It's less, stressful maybe. It's still hyper competitive, but it's not as dog eat dog as perhaps in Europe. Ultimately, despite the fact that F1 is global, it is Europe centric. You have to understand that mindset. So I think in order to succeed currently, it still probably makes more sense to race in Europe, to get in that pyramid and to go and race in Italian F4 and, whatever, but, and to race on those tracks. Those tracks are still critical to understand. But I think having the exposure that F1 has now in the United States, I think that's going to change a lot of perceptions. I think Americans are going to be more open to race in Europe. Europeans are more open to race in America. And I think the FIA is finally starting to understand that, the racing in North America is incredibly competitive, and it should be treated as so, and it should be treated on an equal level as European racing. And I think that's a little bit of part of the problem. But ultimately, for a North American to succeed and make it to Formula One, I think that they really do need to look at racing in Europe in the short term anyways. We'll see how things pan out in the long term, but I think that's going to be a critical decision that they have to make. And unfortunately, they have to make that fairly early in their careers. But yeah, I think that right now is the biggest issue. And then NASCAR is the big, giant in the room. It is still bigger than F1. It is obviously bigger than IndyCar. And a lot of young drivers are making the decision at an early age to go to race NASCAR because it is, it's American, it's, accessible, and the infrastructure is there to support them in their careers to grow into NASCAR. So, that's something that that makes a lot of sense for a lot of young drivers, and it should be. Look, ultimately, you want to race as a professional, and whatever works for you is what you should approach. The big issue that North American drivers have in racing in Europe is sponsorship. In NASCAR, you can have an American sponsor, and they will stick with you, potentially all the way to NASCAR. Formula One and racing in Europe, it's tough for like a Canadian driver, for example, who has Canadian sponsors who might have no exposure in Europe or in the United States. Why would they want to, basically continue the relationship in potentially F4 and, Formula Regional and Formula 3 in Europe when it does nothing for them from a business perspective? So that's where they have a tough time. So, all those things are things that affect the amount of Americans and Canadians that race in F1. It's a global sport, and And we've seen scenarios where, for example, I remember Labatt's wanted to promote their brand in Europe, so they started supporting Canadian drivers in that FIA global pyramid in Europe. And that's something that a young driver potentially could start looking at. If they want to go to F1 and they're talking to sponsors, understand what's their exposure in Europe or where these series race, and do they want to grow that exposure? Is that part of their business plan? And if it is, then it could potentially work very well for them. But it's still kind of two solitudes, I suppose, in a way. But I think that's changing. I think that is changing. And the awareness of Formula One in the United States and Canada can only benefit young drivers ultimately. Maybe not necessarily in the short term, but I think in the long term, it will make a big difference.
I think it's good insight from your seat. I realize that our time is drawing to a conclusion. So I have to say, regretfully, we got to end it today. Hopefully we can have a future conversation, go into some more hot topics and other things that I think would be super helpful to any of our listeners or fans that are wanting to really understand what it takes to do. Because my perspective is it's very easy, especially as a non-racer, to just turn on that TV and watch the sport and not realize the hard work, discipline, sacrifice that was made to get that racer onto that track. And especially in the case of Formula One, to achieve that level of skill and to be selected, let alone to eventually become world champion. And so it's important, if we're wanting to really see the sport continue to thrive, and especially new fans, to be able to have that in the background so you have greater respect for the driver, but also for the teams and everybody who's making this sport possible. And so hopefully it'll continue to evolve and develop to the best that it can. And I love your story of how you saw this need and now are helping the sport to continue to thrive. So thank you for that, Mark. We really appreciate that.
Well, thanks for the kind words. And I always encourage people. I get a lot of email from young drivers, from people that are interested in motorsport. I always say reach out. If you go on motorsport-prospects.com, there's a contact form that you can fill out. I get the email directly to me. I respond to all emails. So if you're just curious, you have specific questions, by all means, reach out. Like I said, the site is undergoing a restructuring, a redevelopment, and the plan is to launch completely in February 1st. Please reach out. You can subscribe to the newsletter as well. On the website, there's a spot there where you can put in your information. And the newsletter basically gives a recap of what was covered on the week before. And you look, the more drivers, the better. The more people interested in motorsport, the better. Part of the mission of Motorsport Prospects is to encourage people to get involved in motorsport. I say the more the better. That's always been my philosophy. So, don't be shy to reach out.
That's awesome. Well, I can wholeheartedly say you're doing an amazing work, and I have been a beneficiary of that. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
So on that note, I look forward to our next conversation. Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, sabrina@2guysaGirlandF1.com. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.